This episode's sponsored by CuriosityStream. Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and for the next couple of videos, I'll be doing two reviews back to back. Elizabeth and its sequel, Elizabeth the Golden Age. It's been a while since I've done a historically inaccurate film, but by God, this is one of the worst. It seems to me that the filmmakers were more interested in making a period drama rather than an actual representation of history. Like a block of Swiss cheese, you're gonna find holes in it everywhere. From ridiculous time jumps, to characters behaving in ways they never did, to events that never happened at all. And the worst part is that they're all wedged in together with real history, giving the illusion of authenticity. But what really worries me is the idea that somewhere in the world, there's a misinformed teacher showing these movies in a classroom, whose students are going to walk out thinking, this is what it was like during Queen Elizabeth's reign. And as I go step by step in this episode pointing out all the inaccuracies and all the impossibilities, you're going to see why they shouldn't as well. My fellow history buffs, here is part one of my double feature review. This is Elizabeth. So the movie begins during the reign of Queen Mary I. It is a time of religious strife and division, as the followers of two faiths, Protestants and Catholics, are locked in a bitter struggle for the soul of England. Queen Mary is a Catholic herself, as was the entire country when she was born. That all changed when her father, King Henry VIII, broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in 1533. His reason for doing so was to divorce his first wife, the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Apart from Mary, none of the children she bore Henry had lived, and the one thing he desired above all else was a son and heir. But once his wife reached menopause, that became an impossibility. Henry knew that if he was to continue having children, he would have to marry another wife. Easier said than done, because the Pope had forbidden any discussion of divorce. Nevertheless, he got the Archbishop of Canterbury to declare his marriage to Catherine null and void, thereby delegitimizing Mary's claim to the throne and making her a bastard. What really pushed him to do this was because he had gotten his mistress, Anne Boleyn, pregnant and secretly married her, so in the off chance that the child was a boy, it wouldn't become a bastard either. However, the child turned out to be a girl that they called Elizabeth. Needless to say, this scandal rocked the Catholic world, but there wasn't much the Pope could do about it, because elsewhere on the European continent, a new religious and political movement was making waves. It was called the Protestant Reformation, and its followers fervently believed that the Holy Catholic Church was a corrupt and decadent system, that the path to true salvation wasn't through ancient rituals, but by scripture. These Protestants were immediately denounced by their fellow Catholics as heretics. As with all great movements, it started out small, but it gained traction over time. Henry himself had been a devout Catholic all his life, but that was to change when he learned that his precious Anne Boleyn was also a Protestant. At first, he cornered her and demanded to know what she was doing with a heretical book in her bedchambers. But his demeanor changed when she explained what the book was about. It was called The Obedience of a Christian Man, and it was written by an English Protestant called William Tyndale, who promoted this idea that the head of a country's church shouldn't be a pope, but the king. Unsurprisingly, this book spoke to Henry on a personal level, and suddenly, Protestantism didn't seem like such a bad thing after all. In 1534, England officially broke away from Rome's authority when its parliament passed through the Act of Supremacy, which established Henry as the head of the Church of England. Not only that, but they also passed the Treasons Act that same year, which meant that anyone who complained about these religious reforms or the legitimacy of Henry's second marriage would lose their heads, which many people did. Then in 1536 came the dissolution of the monasteries, where England's nunneries, friaries, and monasteries were disbanded, looted, and their land sold to the highest bidder. Before Henry, there used to be over 800 of these holy shrines throughout England. By the time he died in 1547, there were none left. Now let's jump forward to Queen Mary's reign. When she came to power in 1553, the Protestant faith had been growing mostly unchallenged for nearly 20 years, and as a fanatical Catholic, she would try to undo everything her father had started. Her most infamous act was to try and purge her country of Protestants through mass burnings, where nearly 300 people died in a short 5-year reign.
We are come to witness the burning of these Protestant heretics who have denied the authority of the one true Catholic Church and of His Holiness the Pope. Let them burn for all eternity.
Now the movie Elizabeth begins with one of these burnings, Not just any burning, but a very important one. But before the opening credits even finish, we get our first inaccuracy. The movie states that it takes place in 1554, but the burning of Protestants didn't begin until February 1555, and the one we see on the screen are of Anglican bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley that happened in Oxford on the 16th of October 1555. You can clearly hear Ridley's name being called out in the crowd.
God bless you, Master Ridley!
Now, I can't tell you who this random woman is being burnt with them, because there isn't any mention of her in the historical records. There's this famous book called the Book of Martyrs that was written by an English Protestant historian called John Foxe in 1563, and he covered this burning in great detail. There's even a picture of it. If you look closely, you can see Latimer on the left and Ridley on the right, but there's no one else with them. So you might be asking yourself, if the burnings didn't happen until a year later, then why did they set the movie in 1554? Because that was when Mary crushed a Protestant rebellion led by Sir Thomas Wyatt in February 1554, and he wanted to overthrow Queen Mary and replace her with a Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth. Now I understand that sometimes films do need to condense historical events for the purpose of pacing, except in this circumstance, you get this false impression that the rebellion was a reaction to Mary's policy of burning Protestants. But that wasn't the case. Sir Thomas Wyatt was rebelling because Mary wanted to marry Prince Philip of Spain, which was widely unpopular. People didn't want to be ruled by a Spanish king and have their country turned into another satellite state of the Spanish Empire. That was what the rebellion was really about. But there's no mention of this in the movie, because they also get the timeline wrong, where we see Mary is already married to Philip, even though that didn't happen until months after Wyatt's rebellion. They hadn't even met each other by this point. What they do get right in this scene is Mary's paranoia about her sister's potential involvement to overthrow her.
My sister was born of that whore, Anne Boleyn. She was born a bastard. She will never rule England. Your Grace will find some proof of her treachery. I am most sure of it.
So in the next scene, we see Mary's guards ride out to arrest Elizabeth in a country estate in Hatfield. At least that's what the movie wants us to believe, because I can assure you that ugly medieval-looking castle is not Hatfield House. This is Hatfield House. Glorious, elegant, and much more fitting for a Renaissance princess, wouldn't you say? And yet this movie keeps using buildings for the wrong time period as the locations. Like, I love how all the palace sequences are shot in the 11th century Durham Cathedral, which was built by the bloody Normans. I mean, look at this place. It's depressing. The Tudors didn't want to live in the stone halls of their Norman ancestors. They wanted to bling things up in style, like in Hampton Court Palace, where Henry VIII spent more money pimping out the place than anything you'll find on MTV Cribs. You have landscape gardens, hunting ground, beautiful wooden paneled walls, gold-fitted ceilings, an indoor tennis court, and fountains that didn't flow with water, but red wine. If you look at this painting right here, you can see people drinking from it getting absolutely plastered. There's even a guy vomiting in the corner. Honestly, the only Norman building you'd find any Tudor living in would be the dreaded Tower of London, and that was only when they didn't have a choice. Elizabeth certainly didn't anyway, when she was locked up there on the 18th of March, 1554. In the movie, she's interrogated upon her arrival, even though in real life that happened earlier in Whitehall. In fairness, this is an understandable inaccuracy because they're just trying to condense stuff down. What isn't, though, is when the question of Elizabeth's religion pops up, and Bishop Stephen Gardiner says this.
Why we must tear ourselves apart for this small question of religion. Catholic and Protestant.
You think it's small, though it killed your mother?
What does religion have to do with Anne Boleyn's death? Whether it's true or not, she was charged and beheaded for adultery by her husband, Henry VIII. He most likely killed her because she wasn't producing any sons, and he took advantage of the rumors to make way for his third wife, Jane Seymour. Being Protestant had nothing to do with it. Anyway, Elizabeth stayed in the Tower as a sister's prisoner for the next 2 months, fearing each day would be her last. However, we don't get any impression of how much time has passed in the film, because in the very next scene, Mary summons Elizabeth. In real life, this didn't happen until nearly a year later, on the 17th of April, 1555. Prior to that, Elizabeth was released from the Tower on the 22nd of May, 1554, because there wasn't enough evidence to execute her for treason. So, instead, Mary placed her under house arrest in Woodstock Palace near Oxford. The reason Elizabeth was called to court was because Mary was pregnant and wanted her sister to be there for the christening. At least that's what Mary believed. Her first symptoms of pregnancy began as far back as September the previous year. But apart from gaining little weight and no longer menstruating, there was no real indication that she was with child. There were even rumors circulating in the court how this was even possible, because it was no secret that her husband Philip found his devoted wife repulsive.
Your Majesties, this is most wondrous news.
Indeed. We do thank God for this, our most happy condition.
We must also thank His Majesty for this blessed event, which is nothing short of a miracle.
This, of course, turned out to be a phantom pregnancy, as May came and went, followed by June, then July, and still no baby in sight. Finally, on the 4th of August 1555, after 11 months of waiting, Mary admitted defeat, and her husband Philip abandoned her and left England. In the film, we see Mary explain as much to Elizabeth, as well as her suspicion on what caused the phantom pregnancy.
My husband is gone. They have poisoned my child. They say it is a tumour. Oh.
Madam, you are not well.
They say this cancer will make you queen, but they are wrong. Look there. It is your death warrant. All I need do is sign it.
Okay, just give me a minute here because there's a lot to unpack. Despite how crazy Mary was, she didn't believe that her baby had been poisoned by Protestant heretics. More than anything, she thought it was a punishment from God for being too lenient with them, which made her even more aggressive in their persecutions. Also, her doctors didn't diagnose a false pregnancy as a tumor.
It's not a tumor. It's not a tumor at all.
This is more of a theory held by contemporary historians. Truth is, we don't know if it was a tumor or a cyst, or just as likely, the whole thing could have been made up in her head. The mind is a powerful thing after all, and Mary was so desperate to have a child that she had not one phantom pregnancy, but two. And each time, the doctors diagnosed the symptoms of being with child. Also, by this point in their relationship, Mary didn't threaten Elizabeth with signing her death warrant. They had moved past the whole Wyatt rebellion thing, and Elizabeth stayed with her sister until October 1555 before returning to Hatfield, no longer as Mary's prisoner. The next thing that happens in the movie is the Duke of Norfolk and some Catholic courtiers voice their concerns about exiled Protestant nobles returning to England.
Your Grace, Protestants are already returning from abroad.
Yes, and have made plans to massacre every Catholic in England.
Okay, this is just bollocks. Why would they return now? Just because Mary didn't have a baby and she's feeling sick? She's still alive, she's still in power, and she continued to burn Protestants as far ahead as 1558. It would be pretty bad timing to come back now, don't you think? Anyway, there's a huge time jump by about 3 years, but this doesn't get mentioned in the movie. As far as the audience is concerned, it's still 1554. By this point, Mary is lying in her bed, sick and dying, and the Duke of Norfolk is trying to get her to sign Elizabeth's death warrant, which of course didn't happen. Nor did the Spanish ambassador offer Elizabeth King Philip's hand in marriage.
My sister is not yet dead. Her bed is still warm.
His Majesty finds it already cold.
The only thing Philip tried to do when Mary was alive was to offer Elizabeth his cousin's hand in marriage, the Duke of Savoy, which she refused outright. It was only when his wife died did Philip propose to Elizabeth, but was also refused. And so on the 17th of November, 1558, Queen Mary, forever to be remembered by history as Bloody Mary, died in her sleep, and a Protestant half-sister, Elizabeth, succeeded in her name as the new Queen of England.
The Queen is dead! Long live the Queen! Long live the Queen!
Elizabeth's coronation took place on the 15th of January 1559 at Westminster Abbey, and for the most part, it is very well portrayed in the movie. The only thing that doesn't make sense is the Duke of Norfolk's role in it, since he's not an ordained member of the church, so there really is no reason for him to be there. However, I would like to credit the movie for having the bishop say this line.
I crown thee, Elizabeth, Queen of England, Ireland, and France.
You might think calling her the Queen of France is a bit of an empty title, since England no longer had any possessions there. Reason why is because her sister Mary lost Calais to the French a year before. This is a huge humiliation to the English because they had ruled it for over 200 years, and the last piece of territory, mainland Europe, was gone. Having said that, it is true that Elizabeth still claimed the crown of France. It's a very small line that most people won't notice, but I'm very happy to see it there. Following the coronation, we have a little scene where Elizabeth's advisors tell her that she's inherited a bankrupt kingdom that's surrounded by enemies, mainly France and Spain, which is all true. But then William Cecil, her Secretary of State, says this to her.
Apart from abroad, here at home there are those who wish your majesty ill. Mary of Scots has already laid claim to your throne. And Norfolk covets it relentlessly. Madam, until you marry and produce an heir, you will find no security.
Now, it is true that Mary of Scots laid claim to the English throne. She was next in line after all, but what isn't true is the remark of the Duke of Norfolk coveting it by this point. And the reason why is because he didn't consider overthrowing Elizabeth until 10 years later. In the film, he's portrayed to be a fanatical Catholic who, until very recently, was openly hostile towards Elizabeth. He even begs Mary to sign her death warrant. So, by the movie's own logic, what is he still doing there? I mean, it's a bit dumb to keep a man like that in court, don't you think? In real life, one of the first things Elizabeth did when she came to power was to kick out most of the Catholics from the old regime. She didn't need to do that with the Duke of Norfolk since he was actually a Protestant. But apart from that, it is true that Elizabeth's advisors were constantly nagging her to marry and produce an heir, which was a little difficult since most of Europe's royalty were Catholic. Everyone had seen how badly things had turned out for Mary when she married Philip, and Elizabeth didn't want to make the same mistake she did. Alternatively, Elizabeth could have married a Protestant European or an English noble, but that would mean having to share power, which didn't sound appealing either. So what she did instead was procrastinate on the issue. She would lead men on who all thought they might have a chance, and then she would pull back just as suddenly. This was politically advantageous throughout her reign because it played everybody against each other.
I suppose the French do offer some suitor to her.
Naturally. Everything now depends upon the husband that woman takes.
But out of all the potential suitors, there was one man who tempted her the most, Lord Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. They were both roughly the same age and were childhood friends. We are first introduced to Robert Dudley at the beginning of the movie when Elizabeth is in Hatfield, and the way he sort of swaggers in with his open frilled shirt instantly reminds me of those awful romantic novels from the 90s with Fabio in the front cover.
My, these seas are certainly heaving.
Well, no more than your bountiful bosom, milady.
Later we see them dancing, brushing their cheeks together, cuddling, and being very intimate with each other. This all happens, of course, right before Elizabeth is arrested and taken to the Tower. And before she leaves, he whispers this in her ear.
Do not be afraid of them.
It's a very touching moment, but unfortunately, it isn't true. Dudley didn't visit her in Hatfield during Mary's reign because he had been arrested for treason and sent to the Tower himself a year before. This was because he and his father were involved in a coup to place Lady Jane Grey as the Queen of England in 1553. When that failed, Dudley saw his father, his brother, and his sister-in-law executed. It was during his time in the Tower that he and Elizabeth were reunited and developed an unbreakable bond. So you might be asking yourself, if they really were in love, then why didn't they just get married when Elizabeth became queen? Well, because Robert Dudley still had the stigma of being a traitor, which made him one of the most unpopular men in England. There's of course an even bigger reason why they couldn't get married, but I'll get more into that later. Now, as to the possibility of them being secretly lovers has intrigued historians for centuries. They've obsessed over little details like how Elizabeth seemed to favor Dudley by appointing him Master of Horse, whose duties require regular meetings with the Queen. This, and among other things, sparked gossip in the court, and every interaction they had came under heavy scrutiny. So, if they really were lovers, then they had to have been subtle about it. But there's nothing subtle about the way they're dancing here, especially when he kisses her on the cheek in front of everybody. But that's not even the worst part of it, because later on we see them bump uglies in front of an actual audience.
I wish you to show me Her Majesty's sheets every morning. I must know all her proper functions.
Proper functions, Sir William.
Indeed. Her Majesty's body and person are no longer her own property. They belong to the state.
Honestly, guys, would you trust your deepest, darkest secrets to these giggling idiots? Obviously, these girls never covered up any affair. In fact, Kat Ashley, Elizabeth's favorite lady-in-waiting, begged her to stop seeing Dudley when rumors of an affair started to circulate. Anyway, after that little peep show, we see Elizabeth summoned by the Duke of Norfolk to the War Council where he presses her to send an army into Scotland.
Mary of Guise has increased the French garrison in Scotland by 4,000 men.
Perhaps more.
Madam, I'm afraid the French mean to attack while we are still weak, and while your Majesty's reign is still uncertain.
This is not true at all. The French sent reinforcements to Scotland because they wanted to crush a Protestant rebellion taking place. Much like England, Scotland was heavily divided by Protestant and Catholic factions. Mary of Guise was a French noblewoman who ruled Scotland as Queen Regent in her daughter's name, Mary Queen of Scots, who was still living in France at the time. And because of Mary of Guise's anti-Protestant policies, the Scottish lords had taken up arms against her and called on England to send military aid, which Elizabeth did in 1560. And what we see in the film is the aftermath of the English and Scots defeat at the Siege of Leith Castle. Now, this was a battle that the French won fair and square, but the movie would have us believe that the reason why the English lost was because his army was made up of young boys instead of highly trained fighting men.
Et dites à cette reine bâtarde de ne plus envoyer des enfants pour combattre Marie de Guise.
This false narrative is pushed even further by Elizabeth when she hears the news.
Why did they send such children? Why did they not send proper reinforcements?
Because the bishops would not let them. They spoke against it in the pulpits.
Oh, shut up, movie. You and I both know that the bishops weren't in a position to do anything about Scotland. Basically, the film is trying to link two different events that have nothing to do with each other and swapping them around in the timeline. According to the film's plot, the bishop's interference with the army are what provoked Elizabeth to pass two acts through Parliament, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. They're blended together in the movie as just one act, but basically, they restored England's independence from Rome, they made Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England, and they re-edited the Common Prayer Book so both Catholics and Protestants could participate in communion. When both acts were voted in through Parliament, it became law for anyone holding public or church office to swear allegiance to Elizabeth as the head of the new church, and all but one of the Catholic bishops refused to do so. In response, she had them arrested, thrown into the Tower, and replaced with Protestants. The arresting of the bishops began in April 1559, months before Elizabeth's army fought in Scotland in 1560. Basically, these two events you see in the film's timeline should be switched. But we're not quite done there, my fellow history buffs, because following the defeat in Scotland, Mary of Guise sent an offer of peace to Elizabeth under one condition.
What condition?
That your Majesty considers the proposal of her nephew, the Duke of Anjou.
Elizabeth reluctantly accepts as long as Henri, the Duke of Anjou, comes to England himself. But when the two finally meet in person, let's just say she's less than impressed with her French suitor.
I am Anjou! Yes, I am Anjou, yes! I am Anjou! Yes. Oh, nom de Dieu, elle aime.
By this point in the review, would you be surprised to find out this is also bullshit? Somehow I doubt it. Anyway, where do I start? Mary of Guise wasn't the aunt of Henri the Duke of Anjou and didn't offer him as a suitor to Elizabeth. Nor does she have an implied sexual relationship with him. The reason why is because their families were from rival houses and were sworn enemies. So, it really wouldn't do Mary any favors if Henri became the King of England. Also, it wasn't Henri's idea to initiate marriage talks, but Elizabeth's. In 1570, 10 years after the battle in Scotland. In the end, this brief courtship didn't lead anywhere, but not for the reason the movie says.
What? What?
What? What do you mean, what? Is this movie taking the piss?
Oh, yes, I am wearing a dress. Yes, I'm wearing a dress.
There is no evidence to support that Henri was a cross-dresser, nor was he bisexual as implied with this little harem. Henri had many famous mistresses, but historians have been unable to name a single man he could have slept with. They think it's more likely that these rumors started because Henri didn't like war and he didn't like hunting, which was considered very effeminate in those days, and this was used by his political enemies to turn the people of France against him. But you know what? Even if he was a cross-dresser, this still couldn't have happened because Elizabeth and Henri never met in person. Not that this particularly matters to Elizabeth in the movie, since she never shows any interest in in marrying Henri, not even for appearance's sake. Remember that the reason his character is even there is so England could avoid a war with France. But instead of playing the game like the real Elizabeth would have, she and Dudley flaunt their affair in front of everybody from their little love boat. So William Cecil is understandably angry with his behavior and scolds Elizabeth like a child. And then the movie drops this historically inaccurate bombshell on us.
Yes, Sir William, I live my life in the open. I am surrounded by people. I do not understand how so bad a judgment has been formed of me.
Madam, you cannot marry Lord Robert. He's already married.
True Elizabethan history buffs will no doubt hate this scene because it makes the Virgin Queen look like an idiot. It was no secret that Lord Robert was married. Pretty much everyone in Europe knew about it. In fact, it was so well known that some kings didn't even want to marry off their sons to Elizabeth in the first place. This was another big reason why Elizabeth and Robert's relationship was so scandalous. Even if they weren't actual lovers, it certainly appeared that way in court gossip. But this idea that Queen Elizabeth, this highly intelligent woman, one of the greatest monarchs in English history, didn't know her boy toy was married is ridiculous. Of course she knew about it, she just didn't care. And that's what really pissed people off, because Elizabeth was supposed to be looking for a husband and instead she was faffing about with someone who was already married. But whatever their relationship was, it took a major hit on the 8th of September 1560 when Lord Robert's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead with her neck broken at the bottom of a flight of stairs. Officially, it was ruled as an accident, but rumors quickly circulated that she may have been murdered instead. Amy's sudden death now freed Lord Robert to marry Elizabeth, which people found extremely suspicious. With Elizabeth's reputation at stake, there was no way she could possibly marry Lord Robert from that moment on. Now, the possibility of Amy Robsart's murder has seen some renewed interest over the years. There's this great documentary called Elizabeth Killer Queen, where they go over all the evidence that suggests foul play, including the recently rediscovered coroner's inquest that describes short puncture wounds to Amy's skull that were somehow left out of the original court records.
If Amy had a 2-inch deep wound to the top of her head, I'd be looking for some sort of mace ball on the end of a chain with spikes on it, some sort of halberd or spear, something of that sort of nature. I think I'd be saying to the officer investigating to mount a full-scale murder inquiry.
It's definitely worth checking out if you're into this sort of thing. And if you are, you can find this documentary and thousands like it on CuriosityStream. It's a subscription streaming service that has nothing on it but documentaries, including history, and you can watch them all for just $2.99 a month. But the best part is that fans of history buffs can get their first 30 days for free. And what's more is that with CuriosityStream, you'll also be getting Nebula for free, another streaming service that hosts content from many creators, including history buffs. It's a platform without the restrictions of advertiser-friendly policies you'd find elsewhere. So basically, any videos of mine that need to be heavily edited or go missing will have no problem being uploaded to Nebula, the way they were meant to be seen. To get started, all you have to do is enter the promo code curiositystream.com/historybuffs. So in the movie, the relationship between Elizabeth and Robert ends when she finds out about his marriage and screams at him in a very public setting. This of course didn't happen with Robert's first wife, but it did with his second wife, Lettice Knollys. She used to be one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, had secretly married Robert in 1578, over 20 years after the movie is set. And Elizabeth was so jealous and so angry that she banished Lettice Knollys from court. Now, there isn't a Lettice Knollys in the film, but there is an Isabel Knollys, who her character is clearly inspired by. We see Robert and Isabel have an affair, but instead of them marrying in secret, she dies after wearing a poisoned dress meant to kill Elizabeth, which of course didn't happen. Nor did Elizabeth nearly get shot in the face by an assailant armed with a crossbow. These failed assassination attempts are pondered by Elizabeth's famous spy master, Francis Walsingham. Now, I must stress that although Walsingham played a major role in Elizabeth's reign, he didn't become a principal secretary until 15 years later in 1573. Nevertheless, he concludes that the crossbow attack was from the Duke of Norfolk, and the poisoned dress was sent by Mary of Guise to Elizabeth for refusing to marry the Duke of Anjou. Francis Walsingham then heads to Scotland to have dinner with Mary of Guise, and pretends to switch sides, also he can seduce and kill Mary in her sleep, which is ridiculous because Francis Walsingham wouldn't be dumb enough to murder the Queen Regent of Scotland as her guest, because it would only serve to implicate him and Elizabeth. Also, he didn't need to kill Mary of Guise because she died of dropsy a month after the Siege of Leith. As for the Duke of Norfolk's crossbow attack, although that didn't happen, the movie does tie it to a real plot he was involved in against the Queen.
His Majesty has also had a rumor.
The world is filled with rumors, Monsignor.
That your Grace has made contact with Mary of Scots to promote your ambitions. Even that you mean to marry her.
Basically what happened was that Mary, Queen of Scots, the daughter of Mary of Guise, fled to England in 1568 after being forced to abdicate her throne. She was given safe refuge by Elizabeth, but for all intents and purposes, she was her prisoner. This was mainly for two reasons. Since Mary was Elizabeth's cousin, she did have a claim to the English throne, which she had pressed in the past. But what made her especially dangerous was the fact that she was a Catholic, and many of England's Catholics, especially the Northern Earls, wished to see Mary as the Queen of England, not Elizabeth. Not wishing to live the rest of her life as a prisoner, Mary reached out to Norfolk and proposed marriage. This was an ideal match for Mary, because not only was he the richest man in England, he was also Elizabeth's cousin and had a claim to the throne himself. As for Norfolk, he was ambitious and opportunistic. He agreed to Mary's proposal. Now in the movie, they take this real plot that actually happened and they link it to another historical plot called the Babington Plot. Trouble is, neither of them have anything to do with each other. The Duke of Norfolk first rebelled against Elizabeth in 1569, whilst the Babington Plot took place in 1586, 17 years apart. But you want to know what's really funny? When they made the sequel, Elizabeth the Golden Age, which is even worse by the way, they used the Babington Plot again, because they ran out of stuff to talk about. That's what happens when you try to cram most of the biggest events in Elizabeth's life into the first few months of her reign. You probably want to know what the Babington Plot was about, but I don't like to repeat myself, unlike these movies. So what I'm going to do is cover that in the next review. In the meantime, let's finish things off with the Duke of Norfolk. Now, what the movie doesn't mention is that Norfolk was involved in two plots against the Queen, but they have condensed both into one, which is fair enough in my opinion for the purpose of pacing, but here is basically what happened. In 1569, the Catholic Northern Earls rebelled against Elizabeth with the support of the Duke of Norfolk, although just before it started, he tried calling it off because he had lost his nerve, but by then, it was too late. The plan had already been set in motion to raise an army large enough to march south and liberate Mary of Scots from her prison. But the rebellion soon collapsed when it failed to gather the popular support it needed to succeed. The rebel leaders were quickly executed, and the Duke of Norfolk was arrested and thrown into the Tower. For 9 months he remained confined there, but escaped the chopping block by confessing to his part in the Northern Uprising and begged for mercy. Elizabeth granted it and placed him under house arrest. Now, you'd think that Norfolk would be thanking his lucky stars and give up any idea of overthrowing Elizabeth, but you'd be wrong. On the 25th of February 1570, Pope Pius V issued a papal bull against Elizabeth that excommunicated her and forbade all of England's Catholics to obey her. This historic moment is shown in the movie, even though the timeline is 12 years off, and Daniel Craig's character John Ballard wasn't involved. However, this next little bit is true.
His Holiness also decrees that any man who should undertake her assassination will be welcomed by angels into the kingdom of heaven. Give these letters of blessing and hope to our friends in England.
This new plot was led by an Italian banker named Roberto di Rodolfi, and he not only had the Pope's blessing, but also King Philip of Spain. The plan was similar to the one before, that after Elizabeth's assassination, to place Mary of Scots on the English throne and have her marry the Duke of Norfolk. However, the conspiracy was discovered when Charles Bailey, one of Mary's followers, was arrested in Dover carrying incriminating letters. Under torture, he confessed everything, including that Norfolk had been funding the conspirators himself. Now, when Elizabeth finds out about the plot in the movie, it leads to this big climax where she orders the arrest and execution of all the conspirators in a single day. And let's just say it looks really similar to the ending of The Godfather. Here, I'll show you.
Do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him.
And all his works?
I do renounce them.
But maybe it's just me. Anyway, I'm sorry to say, but the real events were nowhere near as climactic as what we see in the film. For example, when the Duke of Norfolk was arrested, he didn't get executed right away. After he was found guilty, Norfolk spent 5 months locked up in the Tower because Elizabeth kept signing his death warrant and then changing her mind at the last minute. He was her cousin after all, and she must have felt guilty for what she was being advised to do. Eventually, Elizabeth yielded to pressure from Parliament, and on the 2nd of June 1572, Norfolk was beheaded on Tower Hill. At least that part is correctly portrayed. Unlike the rest of the movie's conspirators, who most of them are executed as well, even though in real life they weren't. For example, Bishop Stephen Gardiner died in 1555, 3 years before Elizabeth became queen. The Earl of Sussex was never involved in any plots against Elizabeth and was a well-respected politician in her court. The Spanish ambassador also couldn't have been killed by Elizabeth, as he died of plague after being recalled to Spain. As for the Earl of Arundel, he had some minor involvement in a few plots against Elizabeth, but not enough to lose his head. The worst he ever got was being placed under house arrest, and 6 months after Norfolk's execution, he was released. That just leaves us with Lord Robert Dudley. Elizabethan history buffs will find this to be the hardest pill to swallow. In the movie, after the Queen dumps him in public, the Spanish ambassador approaches Lord Robert and proposes that he convert to Catholicism and join the conspirators to overthrow Elizabeth. But when his treason is eventually found out, Elizabeth decides to spare his life.
He shall be kept alive to always remind me of how close I came to danger.
As with the rest of the entire effing movie, this is completely inaccurate. Lord Robert never betrayed Elizabeth. For his entire life, he was hopelessly in love with her and remained her most faithful subject. Even when she pushed him away after his marriage to Lettice Knollys, the two eventually made up and remained close until his death. Their relationship is one of the most enduring love stories in history, and the only thing that kept them apart was Elizabeth's title as queen. Whereas at the end of the movie, it's not only Lord Robert's fault that they're not together, but his betrayal indirectly inspires Elizabeth to reinvent herself as Gloriana, as she cuts off her hair in a ritual-like manner and turns celibate.
I have become a virgin.
Then we see her paint her face white and her lips red to symbolize her transformation as England's saint-like virgin queen. If only it were that poetic. The only reason Elizabeth started to take on the heavy makeup was to cover up her smallpox scars that she got back in 1562, whereas in the movie we see it happen after the failed Northern Uprising of 1569. And she also didn't cut off her hair so she could wear wigs. She wore wigs because she was losing her hair. The reason for this is most likely due to the skin whitener she used, called Venetian ceruse. It was made up of vinegar and white lead, which damaged her skin and slowly poisoned her over time. And her makeup remover was even worse, as it had a mixture of rosewater, honey, eggshells, and mercury. As her skin wasted away over the years, she was forced to slather on more and more makeup to cover up the damage. Sadly, by the end of her life, she looked like a clown. And that's about all the inaccuracies I could stomach for this review. No doubt some of you will point out the many I missed out in the comments section, but this video's gone on long enough for me to make my point. The 1998 movie Elizabeth is one of the most historically inaccurate films I have ever covered on this channel. I know there are many of you out there who enjoy watching Elizabeth, but as a historical film, it is terrible. The only thing I liked about it were the performances, especially Cate Blanchett, as she was a perfect casting choice for the Virgin Queen. I understand that sometimes it's necessary to take creative liberties, but at some point you've got to draw the line on how many you can take. Otherwise, you might as well make a fantasy film. At least that way you could do whatever you want. But as historically inaccurate Elizabeth is, it is nowhere near as bad as Elizabeth the Golden Age, which I'll be covering in my next review. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comments section what you thought about Elizabeth. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.